one, they think that they can. Two, to solidify the infrastructure development in those countries, in those areas, so that they will become staunchly Chinese.
My question is, Japan, India, and China, they all sort come from the non-West wave, and now we see that some, formerly colonized countries, non-Western countries, sees China as an alternative to the US model. Now I want to ask why India would rather choose US and Japan as an ally rather than create its own anti-West, for example, challenge or join China.
I really think the Indians do not have a binary choice here, meaning it's not either US, Japan or China. I don't think they see their choices as being binary. I think they see their choices a bit, the current Prime Minister Modi is a very pragmatic person. The reason he gets along really well with Prime Minister Abe is because they're very similar in terms of their personality. Both are ardent nationalists. They're big nationalists. So in that sense, I would be very surprised if India then decides that I should follow 100% what the Americans are doing or 100% somebody else is doing, because no nationalist will actually agree to something like that. With regards to China, I think it's just basic geopolitics. The Chinese are pulling, the Indians feel the Chinese are pulling way too ahead. And in order to balance things out, I think India sees a lot of prospects in working closely with the Americans and the Japanese to improve their economy. But in the long run, like you said, it's unlikely that the Indians will be tilting firmly in one camp or towards one camp, or staunchly anti-Chinese. I don't see that it's going to be naturally a binary choice.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Professor Victor Teo, thank you for the lecture today. You did mention that India is cooperating somehow with North Korea, and they have this historical connection that goes back from the Cold War. But is there any evidence, for example, of technological transfer or cooperation in the development of the North Korean nuclear program?
No, I don't believe the Indians are helping the North Koreans with their nuclear weapons and all, or nuclear program. But having said that, nuclear technology is actually not very sophisticated. A lot of the blueprint necessary for the the building of nuclear weapons or nuclear infrastructure is actually on the internet. So North Koreans could actually have obtained those designs from open sources rather than the Indians.
Professor, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Following on some of your comments, I was wondering, you mentioned that China is currently on the list of unfavorable countries for North Korea due to the fact that the North Korean leadership feels that maybe Chinese government doesn't provide enough of economic assistance or other cooperation. I'm wondering, what about Russia when we see that Russia joins sanctions against North Korea? Does not that upset Russia-North Korean relations?
Russia is interesting. I think the North Koreans traditionally has two very important allies.
Yes.
Russia and the Chinese. But both countries are, the Russians and the Chinese are actually uncomfortable with the notion that North Korea has developed nuclear weapons,
yes.
Because this is actually not in their interests. North Korea does not exhibit a tendency to listen to the Russian government or the Chinese government. But at the same time, the Russian government does not want to see the collapse of the DPRK regime.
Yes.
So I think there is some tension in the relations. But President Putin actually has said that actually as recently as last week, if I remember correctly, or the week before, that the North Korean leader is actually very smart and has won the latest round against the Americans when the North Korean leader reached out to the South Koreans to form a joint team to represent Korea at the Olympics. So to that extent, I think the Russians do not actually feel threatened by North Korea's nuclear program. I mean, they are worried, but they are not particularly concerned like everybody else. The countries that are most concerned is probably Japan and the United States. So I think the Russians see themselves as being playing a role in helping the North Koreans develop and possibly working towards the acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear state. But this is something in the future, down the road.
I see.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for the lecture. It was very interesting. You mainly talked about the relations with India and Japan, or India and the United States, etc. I was wondering, what about the role of the European Union, or for example the UK as a former colonizer? What about India's foreign relations and the European Union?
Actually, I'm not a specialist on Europe, and the reason we didn't cover in today's talk is because this was actually essentially focused on the US-Japan security alliance. But one of the important roles I think the Europeans play is in their alliance with the Americans, and to that extent, really, not all Europeans are the US allies. It's really the British that we're concerned about. So the Europeans' relations with the alliance is actually much more complicated than Japan's alliance with the US. So to that extent, I don't believe that the Indians are working in a big way with the European Union to attract investments. But insofar when the alliance to contain the Chinese are concerned, I think the Europeans have different calculations vis-a-vis the Indians. The One Belt, One Road project ends in Europe. So certain European countries are actually very, they have a lot of stake in this, and they also feel that if successful, their country will tend to gain a lot from the OBOR project. And one of these states is actually Germany. They have a different calculations with regards to the alliance and the OBOR.
Thank you.